Hello, this is Louanne Moldovan. Thank you for joining me for my conversation today with the lovely Sonia Sabnis, Associate Professor of Greek, Latin, and Ancient Mediterranean Studies and Humanities at Reed College. Sonia's research focuses on literature of the Roman Empire and its reception in later traditions. Welcome, Sonia.
Hi, Louanne. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to talk a little bit about my background in discovering the Wild Party and kind of get folks acclimated to it. So I found this book in my then husband's used bookstore in Santa Monica. David Morrison had this charming cornucopia of rare books, and it was a very popular shop for any kind of customer, really, who love books, writers, researchers, and like I said, just bibliophiles. Anybody looking for something, they usually found it there. So I came across that title, right? The Wild Party, and it was so immediately entrancing. When we moved to Portland, David opened a shop, David Morrison Books, off Hawthorne, and it was his idea to start a theater there. And I thought, no, I'm done with theater. And then I looked around and thought, wait a minute, what a great idea. The Wild Party was about the third production we did. I would adapt novels, short stories to the stage. I found literature to be stage worthy. And in this case, The Wild Party just screamed for theatricalization. Hence, dubbed this little theater company, Signet Productions, which Nyla McCarthy, my friend, and I founded together, but I called it a literary cabaret theater because it was living in a bookstore. And with The Wild Party, anything that I presented on the stage, I didn't change a word. And it was just such a natural fit for theatricalizing and dramatizing. It's comprised of vivid characters, a compelling story, and just in great dialogue. In fact, speaking of that, I want to quote Louis Untermeyer, who was an American poet and critic of the time. Joseph Moncure March, I should say right off, is the esteemed author. And he was born in 1899. He wrote The Wild Party in 1926. Mr. Untermeyer said, a post-war nightclubbed, bootlegged, sex-ridden, tabloid-jazzed New York. Repulsive and fascinating, vicious and vivacious, uncompromising, unashamed, and unremittingly powerful.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I was rehearsing this with 5 actors playing 25 roles. And one day, one of the actors, Ted Roysum, who we've lost, but may he rest in peace, he was one of the most brilliant talents ever. He called me and he goes, honey, you got to pick up the New Yorker. The Wild Party is excerpted. It was like the centerpiece of the magazine because Art Spiegelman had re-illustrated it. So this book at the time was collecting dust in used bookstores. Suddenly, the New Yorker's, attention to it now, it was a rare book. Well, it was rare, but it was now valuable. And David got me every edition of it. A few years later, there were 2 simultaneous musical productions being done on Broadway. It was the first time in the history of Broadway theater that 2 shows were being done based on the same source material. One starred Toni Collette and the other Eartha Kitt. Neither was a great hit, but it was notable. So that's kind of my background with it. I fell in love with the writing and with Mr. March and ended up doing the setup, his other epic poem. I should say that this, I didn't even remark about this. It's written in rhyming couplets.
Right.
And the first line is, Queenie was a blonde and her age stood still and she danced twice a day in vaudeville. And it just tells this story as Mr. Untermeyer described. and it's just incredibly riveting and quite unique. Sonia, I'm curious, as a Latin professor.
Yeah. How did I come to be commenting on the Wild Party?
Yes, please tell me.
Yeah, so it intersects with your story in a few ways, in that I first came across the poem, or the verse novella, maybe we can call it also, when in 1994, I think, with Art Spiegelman's edition, because I had become a fan of Spiegelman through Mouse, of course, and
Exactly.
I've kind of picked up anything that he did.
Yeah.
But I found it riveting also. Like, I thought it was just kind of amazing and so unlike anything I had read before, although having a lot in common in some sense, because I really loved reading Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and so the sort of New York jazz age was really interesting to me. And also, I should say, I moved to New York in 1994 for college, so that world I really wanted to sort of know more about. So that was my first introduction to it. And then, as a professor, I discovered that Joseph Moncure March had studied Greek and Latin at Amherst College before and after World War I, and that really piqued my interest some more. And I read a little bit. He writes about studying Greek and Latin at Amherst in A Certain Wildness, as we talked about. And he talks about enjoying translating Homer and translating the Odes of Horace. And both of those really, I got really excited about that because I love both of those poets. And it made me start to think about whether or not, even though there are no overt classical references in the Wild Party or the setup, whether like his interest in Greek and Latin poetry might have filtered into his own compositions.
That's such a great point, Sonia. It must really intrigue you to kind of like be a detective and see if you can discover his, whether it's conscious or not, right? Because he was so deeply immersed in his studies in that regard.
Right.
We also understand he was rather rebellious and anti-authoritarian, which was witnessed at school. He created with another student rather provocative, what was that, a journal?
Yeah, some sort of like pamphlet about the problems with the school.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
I loved his anti-authoritarianism, and it's very much witnessed, the flavor in his writing and his, certainly in the Wild Party, which we're going to get to in a bit about how that's expressed. So the Lost Generation was part of this era and part of the Roaring 20s, and of which he was a member. He wasn't quite a contemporary. I mean, he was a contemporary to Hemingway and to F. Scott Fitzgerald, but his writing kind of set him apart.
Definitely. Yeah. I don't think, and I mean, another thing I should say that I'm interested in the Wild Party and Moncure March is that I think his reception has always been really variable, right? So, I mean, I think for, American literature students now, Hemingway and Fitzgerald are part of the canon and they're not going away. Moncure March will never have that status, right? And even, I mean, if we look at the moments of when he's kind of come back into public discourse, starting with the Wild Party coming out in 1928, as you know, it took him a couple years to find someone who was going to publish it because it was going to be banned, and it was banned in several cities. And so then it became kind of a succès de scandale. Let me say that again. Succès de scandale, because people were so titillated by especially I think the sexual content. But that also is why it was banned, right?
Lady Chatterley's Lover, right?
Right.
Although its literary quality, I don't want to compare, but it was more heightened than Mr. March's.
Yeah, so exactly. And then I think when he came out again with the edition in 1968, he took out some of the comments about blacks and Jews that are not a big part of the Wild Party original text, I should say, but were still something that he had been criticized for with the setup, and so he excised them from that edition, and that's the kind of thing that some people might find objectionable now, but others might not. And then when Spiegelman's edition came out in 1994, some of the reviews were all over the place. So some people thought it was amazing, and they were, like, this is such a great discovery, as you were saying. But there were some critical voices too, and that's interesting to me also because at that point in 1994, what people criticized was the quality of the poetry, right? So it wasn't the content, it wasn't the risque or anything about the people involved in the Wild Party. It was, oh, this is just bad poetry, so why are we giving it credit?
See that, and that pains me because
Yeah.
I think he was innovative and creative. We're going to talk about him right now because Joseph Moncure March, if I didn't say, was born in 1899. He was in World War I at the age of 18, and I just want to say, he said this about his experience and in general about war, that he saw only a very small fragment of the war, but it was more than enough. He said, I don't agree with the old English proverb, one swallow maketh not a summer. When you are on the receiving end of even one artillery barrage, you get the point very quickly. From then on, it's merely a matter of repetition, variations on the somber themes of massive destruction, exhaustion, and sudden, excruciating death. He was quite mature despite his age and coming back from the horrors of that war, when, by the way, the term shell shock was coined, as you know. That was, to me, so deepening to him as an artist. Not that it was manifest in his work, the exact experience.
Yeah, right. He didn't write about it, and I think he makes a big point about not wanting to write about it because his readers don't have that shared experience. But I mean, I guess with all the writers of that generation, since you were asking about the lost generation, I mean, I think we could think about, in March, I would say, there's definitely a sort of an idea that all social norms are out the window, right? Question everything, right? And live in this hedonistic way. I mean, I don't know that the Wild Party is actually saying that because it's probably a satire of that kind of life. But I think he has that in common with certain other artists and writers, like the Dadaists, who are responding to the horrors of World War I also, right? That, if we get to this low point in society, then maybe we need to question everything, right? And maybe start over yeah. I don't know. Again, I don't know that that's obvious in the Wild Party because he really wanted to concentrate on a much different moment of life.
Yes,
right?
And it's
but
so
it affected him.
Absolutely. And the Wild Party itself is so much a reflection of his time. I mean, he talks about going to parties, right, at this young age, and like some friend of his who was very drunk because they're all drinking a lot, and decided he was going to jump from one building where the party was to the next. He was going to leap out that window, and he did it. It's like this was, just sort of the wacky evening at a party.
Yeah, and something that could only, well, not only maybe, but only in Manhattan, I want to say, right? That's
Yes.
It's a very lower Manhattan thing as well.
Right, a New York story. He was a protege of Robert Frost's, and Robert Frost was his professor. They had great talks, and I think Frost really saw a great talent in Joseph Moncure March. I wonder what you think Robert Frost thought of, because I couldn't find anything about his...
I've never been able to find anything there about what Frost actually thought. It's possible that there is something. We were talking earlier about his papers being an Amherst, and maybe if we looked through the correspondence there, we might find something. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think... so first of all, I should say I don't know nearly enough about Frost to comment on this well, and you might want to cut this out later. But I think the simplicity of language, right, was definitely a big influence, and that kind of the sort of telling it like it is and not flowering it up, right? We were talking about that sort of wanting to avoid purple passages and giving a more authentic character to the language. Those, I think, are definitely Frost's influences on March.
Right. He didn't believe in conventional standards of beauty.
Yeah.
He took a dim view of poetic phraseology. So that, as you're saying, the pretentious purple passages made him wince.
Right. Maybe another thing also is the sort of idea that poetry can be narrative, right? So that it's not just an impressionistic one evening this is one evening like this, but tells a story at the same time. Because as we've been saying, the Wild Party has such a plot to it, and in some ways it's just as much a novella as it is a poem.
Absolutely. I want to share something that to me has this it's so contemporary when you hear it. Moncure March talked about the shocked older generation, which deplored the new freedom of that time. He said they were scandalized by the extreme short skirts of the girls, horrified by the way we drank bootleg booze in open defiance of the Volstead Act, which was the enforcement of prohibition, outraged by our indecently lax attitudes towards sex, aghast at our cynical irreverence towards such sacred institutions as the home and mother. It was a complete breakdown of the national moral fiber, and these oldsters prophesied disaster. We were the lost generation, and we couldn't have cared less.
It's fantastic.
And that just could be any generation, right? The
Right.
young versus the old, and
Yeah, the scandal, the importance of one generation's ability to scandalize the older one, I think, is definitely something that just carries across, right?
it's just
Yeah.
universal.
Yeah, and again, like just to repeat a point I made earlier, right? The fact that it's the orgy that scandalized that generation, or in the kind of wanton sexuality. And I don't think that would be true now, right? I think it would take something else to scandalize the older generation.
Speaking of that kind of purple poetry, it's interesting. I'm going to read these 2 lines that he wrote when he was first crafting The Wild Party. Gray eyes, lips like coals aglow, her face was a tinted mask of snow. And then he said, now that imagery was dangerously pretty, too close to the poetry must be beautiful school for his taste. And he replaced it with, well, where do I have that? Well, he went on to describe her quite differently. And we're talking about Queenie, who's the main character
Right.
in the story. So he made this decision. He wasn't going to write anything lyrical or poetical about his characters. Instead, he wanted them to talk in this colloquial slang phraseology of the native New Yorker, of which he was, right? And he wanted the language to suit to the subject matter and to speak with his own voice, like you were saying about that more narrative kind of storytelling in poetry. So he wrote instead, what hips, what shoulders, what a back she had. Her legs were built to drive men mad, and she did. She would skid. But sooner or later, they bored her. 16 a year was her order.
Oh, it's so amazing. And I think the way you read it really captures the importance of rhyme, right? For him, it was all about the rhyme. And that's what I think befuddles some scholars of poetry about it, right? Is that it has a meter, right? It has a sort of a basic four beat meter to it. But he kind of improvs on that too, right? By making the beats go, making the accents go in successive order sometimes, and that is reflected on the printed page when he chops up the lines, right, and makes rhymes,
right?
Like subsequent monosyllabic rhymes, right? I think that is heavily influenced by jazz, right, in terms of changing the rhythm and surprising the audience, but still kind of making you want to tap your foot, right? So that, as I think probably you can attest to more than me, the when you read it aloud, you just want to read it aloud first of all when you're reading it on the page, and then you really want to sort of like add some of your own rhythm to it. I think,
yeah. And when you use the term improvisation, he called The Wild Party an improvisation, and you could just feel his excitement at creating this kind of hybrid. It's funny because you were talking about the 4-foot line. Yeah, he described it that way, and he said it changes abruptly into a pair of 1-foot lines, which is, as you say, on the page, it's divided like that, and then into a couplet with a 3-foot beat. And he realized this is not conventional verse rhythm, but he likened it to a military drum beat. The interval breaks that keep the cadence going until the drums begin their full roll again. And it is like jazz. The rhythm is so much like jazz.
Yeah, I think I made a list here just in preparation for this of some of the adjectives and descriptors that people have used to talk about the Wild Party. So amazing staccato, reflective of the rhythm and spirit of the post-war age, as one critic from 1933. It's jazz age verse that invokes speed, entertainment industry pep, and machine age rhythm, right? And I think that machine age rhythm, like the
post-industrial revolution, yeah.
Exactly. I think that comes out pretty clearly in the sex scene. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think all of those things are operating in his the construction of his rhyme and his verse.
It's just mind-blowing to me. The pacing, and the economy, and like those critics are saying, sort of that swiftness. The images just keep the story moving, which is, he was informed by cinema, and talked about how the technique of cinema, that it's very selective, and every image is significant. So he used that technique. But he had to balance, dialogue and action, and that the characters remain consistent, just like in great storytelling, and that there's this progressive change of mood and behavior the drunker they get.
Yeah.
And he really does track that.
I'm sorry. I love the sort of more novelish aspect of it is the way that each of the chapters or sections is broken up with the candles, like the way the candlelight is changing. So they're getting progressively drunker, but also each section begins with a description of how the candlelight is changing, right? And that, I think, is a very, I love that detail. I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I can feel that cinematic flavor,
right,
because he's setting the scene. Yeah. So he's helping us see what is transpiring and the changes.
Yeah.
It's very funny, which one can believe it reading this piece, that his own preference was always for the disreputable. Mm-hmm. Nice people suspected his formal exterior as a kind of concealing a dark and perverted nature. And I love that he says, I'm going to quote him again, he's so quotable, "The sordid realities of human misbehavior fascinate me, and I cannot help noticing that this depraved taste is now shared by the great majority of my contemporaries, both writers and readers. Perhaps this is because we've become increasingly aware that the world we live in is not very nice after all, and not even the nice people are as nice as we once thought they were. The very word nice has come to have a slightly derogatory connotation. Soon the dictionaries will rate it as archaic, after which it will no doubt become obsolete." And again, that is like, it's so prescient. It's so timely and contemporary.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it's wrong to call The Wild Party a little bit voyeuristic, right? Mm-hmm. Because the where the narrator is positioned.
Absolutely.
You're almost identifying with the guy across the alley.
Yes, calling the police.
Right? Who's just fascinated with everything. But yeah, I mean, as you're saying, that voyeuristic tendency has gotten more and more profound and frightening, frankly, right? As time has passed.
Cloaked by a niceness.
Yes, exactly.
And I really love how he talks about the writer's sort of responsibility and in not glamorizing but reflecting society in which he's living. And I'm going to quote this as well because I want to ask you about this. Because of the certain not reflections, but actually just certain direct incidences in the Wild Party. They're brief, but they're shocking for probably I don't know if shocking is the right word. They're going to be offensive,
right,
for a contemporary audience. And he certainly, as I was saying, he's not glamorizing it. It's a reflection of the zeitgeist in which he was living. So it's kind of like he's questioning the ethical norms, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And this is, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a Roman literature tangent as well here. But I think, well, the first point I would say is that one fault that people have found with the Wild Party is that there's no hero. I mean, so there's no heroic character that you're rooting for,
Exactly.
that you're relating to, right? They're all horrible.
Yeah,
Right?
that's
So,
right.
I mean, you're talking, I think you're alluding to, what a violent man Burrs is.
Correct.
At the beginning, right? And that's established. And so you think, oh my gosh, this is such a brute, like horrible. But then Queenie is immediately also described. I mean, she immediately shows her own violent streak, and you realize that this is how they feed off each other, right? And I think that increases the voyeuristic thing, because you're like, okay, I'm not like these people, right? But I'm
Exactly.
fascinated by watching them go after each other in the way that's sort of the dynamic for the whole poem. So yeah, I think that's one thing. Like, there's nobody in the poem that you really won't like, right? And that it's so fascinating. And then I think the other point, the Roman tangent I would make, is that I'm really interested in comparing the Wild Party to Petronius's Satyricon, which was a novel written in the late first century CE. And particularly this segment that is the most well-known segment of it, called Trimalchio's Dinner Party. And this is interesting in part because of the comparison with Fitzgerald, because Fitzgerald originally wanted to call The Great Gatsby Trimalchio at the West Egg, and so there's an overt reception of Petronius in The Great Gatsby. But then if I can kind of triangulate it a little bit and say, well, the Wild Party has certain things in common with Fitzgerald, so maybe I can sort of see Petronius in the Wild Party as well. And what is interesting about the comparative perspective here is that Petronius's Trimalchio's Dinner Party and Petronius's Satyricon is about Roman freedmen, i.e., freed slaves, right? Freed slaves who have come into their own wealth and are having this very vulgar, to Roman standards, dinner party, where they too are getting progressively drunker and it's getting wilder. And there are some similar motifs of having a friend come in late, in like the sort of, then having kind of a romantic paired trade-off, in the way that Queenie and Burst kind of pair up with their friends, Kate and Black. So there's some similar, just little tiny points of comparison between Petronius and March. But for the reader, who presumably is not of that, or the intended reader is not of that class, right? I think March's audience is not the entertainers that he's writing about, and Petronius's audience is certainly not the freedmen. It's an opportunity to sort of examine those morals and sort of see, well, what are the standards of behavior why do I find this class so fascinating, but also like, how can I judge them, right? And I think the ethics, the morals in the Wild Party, we were talking about this earlier, right? That it seems like anything goes for them, right? As far as sexual behavior, as far as gender norms, right? They're like, they're all over the
Everything's
place.
represented.
Everything is represented, right? But there are these moments, like when the 14-year-old kid gets assaulted, right, that cause them to like stop and say, wait a minute, right? And then violence ensues, of course, right? But I the famous last line about the cops rushing in, like there's so many reasons why that could happen, right? You're like, okay, disturbing the peace, a murder just happened, right? There's an orgy going on here, there's alcohol consumption, right? It's I just to have that whole like array of illegal or problematic behaviors, I think, in one place is definitely what March was interested in, right? It makes it such a great small piece, yeah.
And that he represents that entire, as you just described, well, this wild party with everything in the kitchen sink occurring in rhyming couplets.
Right.
It's just...
Yeah, exactly. I think one critic said that's what makes it not Pulp Fiction, right?
Yes.
If it didn't have that verse, the story and the torridness of the
just be
the
like
apartment,
tabloid.
Exactly, it's Pulp Fiction, right?
So apropos of this narrative he's created and its place in the time in which he was living, he said about being a writer, whether he likes to admit it or not, a writer is embedded in his time. His work reflects the intricate pattern of his ear. He cannot ever completely disassociate himself from it. But a writer makes a bad mistake if he thinks that the accepted standards of his day are permanent or final. The unpredictable tides of change will probably wash away many of the values he considered important and took for granted. His work will eventually be judged by generations whose viewpoint has altered and who do not understand the mood of his era, a mood which is alien to their own times and can never quite be recaptured.
Yeah, yeah. So I think this is a question for your audience too about what do they find in the Wild Party, because we can try to read it through the eyes of someone in the 1920s who would be outraged by this or titillated by it. But I think one critic said of the 1994 edition, now a lot of this sounds kind of quaint and charming, right? It's not scandalous at all. So yeah, in that sense, I think he's very much writing of his own time, right?
But I love how he had that forethought.
Yeah.
Of almost like speaking to himself in the future.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, the mirror of society that he captured is just it's what's so entertaining about it and absorbing about it and provocative about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the repeating what I said earlier, but the fact that it's not the rich people that are the main characters in Fitzgerald, right? It's kind of, both of those can be described as jazz age, right? But March is interested in this class that doesn't usually get a lot of attention, even though they were the entertainers, right, of the generation. And the fact that he can capture it in a way that's not that's made less tawdry because of the verse, right? I think is like his great achievement. Yeah.
Well, before we close, Sonia, do you have any lingering thoughts or anything you want to add?
Well, Louanne, I think one thing that I've been talking about is how different the reception of the Wild Party has been in the years since March wrote it and since it's been republished by various people. So I guess my question for you is in 2021, what makes it compelling to do a new dramatic version of it?
Well, a few reasons. One is I've always been a huge fan of Joseph Moncure March, and I feel like this is worth doing now. Hasn't been done in a long time. We did it for my company many years ago. So I want to honor him. I want to honor this work. I think it'll be very entertaining. There's that aspect. We need some good entertainment. I really want to celebrate, as I mentioned, that kind of innovative or hybrid art form that he created. And it speaks to a certain, well, as he called it, a certain wildness, right? And I love the sense of anti-authoritarian, unconventional, socio-cultural representation. And to me, the Wild Party embodies those ideas and flavors.
Yeah, I think that's great. And now more than ever, right? We need that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking that. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.